Pests beware, your fields have heroes. The Pests and Predators podcast is brought to you by Field Heroes and is powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Learn how beneficial insects fight pests and protect your crops. Visit fieldheroes.ca today.
You're listening to Ruminating with RealAg, the podcast that chews on the latest in beef production, with your host, Amber Bell.
I'm Amber Bell, and your host of Ruminating with RealAg. For today's episode, I'm going to be speaking with Kristin Thompson, who is a knowledge mobilization specialist with Beef Cattle Research Council, or BCRC. And we're going to be talking about dried distillers grains, or DDGs, what use they have, what would be the purpose of feeding them to cattle, whether or not they're best suited for feedlots, cow-calf operations, and how they can be used, what you should be watching out for. So welcome, Kristin. It's great to talk to you. How are you doing?
Good. It's great to be here and talk with you as well.
Right. We're getting calves out right now. It's spring. It's beautiful out.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we're going to be talking about dried distillers grains today, or DDGs. So Beef Cattle Research Council, you guys have done a fair bit of work with this. Can you open us up with kind of telling us about your role with BCRC and how that intersects with cattle nutrition? Because that's basically what we're talking about.
Yeah, for sure. So my role with the Beef Cattle Research Council is as knowledge mobilization specialist. So I work with the knowledge mobilization team at BCRC, where we're responsible for disseminating research information to create producer resources in order to promote the adoption of beneficial management practices on farms across Canada. In addition to that, I work with managing, coordinating our website, beefresearch.ca, infographics development, and one of my main focuses is on creating feed, forage, and nutrition-related resources. So before starting with the BCRC, I worked in the feed industry for over 8 years as a ruminant nutritionist. So I worked with producers from across Canada on formulating their feed rations and how to manage their nutrition programs. So I've been able to apply that knowledge in creating producer resources at BCRC.
That's fantastic. You guys do have some terrific resources, I have to say. I go to it myself quite often. So for those who might be less familiar, what exactly are DDGs and how are they produced?
So in essence, distillers grains are a byproduct of grain-based ethanol production. So in order to produce biofuels, cereal grains such as corn, wheat, or sorghum are heated and then fermented. The starch portion of the grain is converted into ethanol, and then that's removed and used as the biofuels. And then what you're left with is a concentrated mixture of protein, oil, minerals, and fiber. And that is what your distillers grains are. So typically you'll have two different components. You've got your distillers grains as well as thin stillage. So the distillers grains, they can be fed as wet distillers, but are more often further dried down and available as dried distillers grains, which is kind of the most common form that would be available for beef producers. The thin stillage, it can be fed as a water source in rations, but most often it is also further concentrated and dried down and then added back to the distillers grains to create dried distillers grains with solubles.
So this is basically a waste product coming from distillery processes.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yeah,
okay. Is there any use for it outside of cattle?
Good question. Typically, no. So having it being fed or available to livestock producers is, a great way to not have the level of waste that you otherwise would have.
That's great. And historically, how have distillers grains been used on Canadian cattle farms? And has that changed over time?
So the distillers grains have been used for decades on livestock operations. Historically, they were initially used more on the dairy side as a protein and energy supplement. But as the demand for biofuels increased, there increased the availability of the byproduct, right? So it became more available for other livestock producers to have access to it. So then it started being used more on beef operations, particularly when you're looking at kind of the backgrounding and feedlot side. as they tend to have a higher usage volume for that ingredient, so they can use more of it.
Right, that makes sense. And so from a nutritional standpoint, we'll kind of dive into that as that's sort of your expertise there. What makes DDGs a valuable feed ingredient from the nutritional standpoint?
So distillers grains, they're a really great source of protein, a moderate source of both fiber and oil, and then they're also a really, really high source of total digestible energy or total digestible nutrients. And that comes from both the residual oil that's in that ingredient as well as the fiber level, because the fiber that's included or that's remaining within the distiller's grain is really digestible. So that increases the available energy from that ingredient. Now, one thing I will mention on it though is with distiller's grains, the nutritional composition can be quite variable, which producers need to understand. And that's mainly due to two reasons. One is the nutritional composition of the parent grain that was used to make the biofuels and thus their distillers grains, as well as the processing method that is employed at the ethanol facility is going to change the composition. But overall, distillers grains, both wet and dried, are very palatable to cattle, so they like to eat it. And it's fed often in a complete feed mills included in manufactured pellets, or it can be used as a top dress onto the base diet.
And when formulating those rations, what are some of the nutritional risks that producers should be looking out for?
So there are a few. So one of the things with distillers grains that you need to keep in mind is that whatever was in the parent grain is going to be 3 to 4 times more concentrated within the distillers, right? Because you're taking out a portion of what was in that grain, and then you're just left with a concentrated mixture at the end. So one of the things that producers should be aware of is that phosphorus levels are typically very high in distillers. So when this ingredient is included in a ration, that ration needs to be fortified with extra calcium. And this is often in the form of limestone, because you want to keep that calcium to phosphorus ratio at the ideal 1.5 to 1 or 2 to 1. So that means 1.5 to or 2 parts calcium to 1 part phosphorus. And the calcium to phosphorus ratio is really important for a lot of body functions. And a imbalance can lead to reduced weight gain, reduced feed efficiency. It can lead to reduced milk production for your lactating cows, as lactating cows have, a 2 to 3 times increased requirement for calcium during lactation. Another thing to watch out for with phosphorus is the development of urinary calculi or kidney stones. So these can create a blockage within the urinary tract, which prevents the animal from voiding urine. So then you'll end up with what producers would typically refer to as water belly. So you'll get these steers with that kind of distended abdomen, and it can be more of an issue with steers as opposed to heifers. So you'll often see it in feedlots is where it typically shows up. Other than the high phosphorus, another thing to watch out for is sulfur. So similar to the phosphorus, the sulfur levels within distillers are also quite high and very variable. So they can range from 0.35% to 1.4%. And there are recommendations as to the limit of sulfur to include in rations for beef cattle, and that sits around 0.4%. So on a dry matter basis. So you can see if you've got distillers that have 1.4% and you're including them at a high level, it doesn't take long to get over that 0.4. And when you're balancing for sulfur within a ration, this also includes the sulfur coming from water. So water can have high sulfur levels in it, and that contributes to that overall sulfur within the ration.
Right.
One of the main issues that will develop with sulfur toxicity is the development of polio or polioencephalomalacia in cattle. So this is a neurological disease resulting in brain damage, and it causes a number of symptoms, including, incoordination and seizures. So that's one of the main things to watch out for. So producers will want to be balancing to be below that 0.4 percent level within their ration for sulfur. And then ensuring that, so thiamine is kind of the treatment for polio. So hopefully producers don't get polio, but there are treatment options to try to help treat it once you do have it. And it's often isolated cases, but there have been instances where they'll have kind of a herd outbreak. If you're in a feedlot, whole pens could go down, depending. And then the last thing I guess I'll mention with nutritional factors that producers should be aware of is the oil content. So it can be variable. It can range from 3 to 11 or 14%. And again, similar to sulfur, the recommendation for maximum fat levels within rations for beef cattle is 6 to 8%. And if you do go above that, you'll often have reduced feed intake and reduced performance. You'll get diarrhea, and it just causes a lot of digestive upsets for the cattle. So again, formulating to be under that minimum or under that maximum. And again, taking into account all the ingredients that are included in that ration. You can't just include distillers up to that 8% because there's fat coming from other ingredients as well.
From a lot of other ingredients, yeah. And how high is that risk, or like what's the margin of risk on that? Is it, okay, I've got too much sulfur, like you're almost immediately going to see, a response in your cattle, or is there a little bit of a margin there of error?
Good question. I don't know what the margin of error would be on that. Mm-hmm. My recommendation is just, make sure you're not going over that 0.4. Test everything and make sure you're not, because it can be disastrous if you're over and you do run into issues.
Right. And the reality is feed testing is good practice no matter what part of the industry you're in.
Yeah, exactly.
It is. So what's the typical inclusion rate for DDGs in backgrounding and finishing diets?
So the answer to that question is it's variable. It depends on the weight of cattle, the age of cattle, and what other ingredients you're including in that ration. Distillers are an excellent substitute for both canola meal or soybean meal when they're included at about 15% of the diet on a dry matter basis. The BCRC was involved in some work in the early 2010s on looking at the levels that you could feed distillers at, and these trials showed that distillers could be fed at up to 40% of the diet, but you need to be cautious and you need to do feed testing to make sure, because the nutritional composition is so variable, you can't just buy the distillers and feed it at 40% because you could have issues. You could have that 1.4% sulfur versus 0.4, and then you're running into issues. So again, feed testing, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so speaking about the actual animal side of things, what is the inclusion of it? How does it affecting daily gain, feed efficiency, carcass quality? What are we looking at, from the animal side?
Mm-hmm. So there's actually been a fair bit of research done in kind of the early 2000s on the impacts of including distillers in feedlot diets or in backgrounding diets. So some research with corn distillers indicated that feed efficiency could be increased in feedlot cattle when corn distillers grains was included, with the maximum response in the cattle being seen at about a 10 to 20% inclusion level. And this increase in feed efficiency could reduce costs quite a bit, provided that the distillers are pricing in at an appropriate price. Research on wheat distillers grains showed that it can be inclusion of about 20% of wheat distillers showed a similar feed efficiency to barley-based diets. However, anything above 20%, there was no impact, or it actually caused a slight decline in feed efficiency. There was a study conducted in 2016 that looked at the impacts of distillers on average daily gain for both backgrounding and feedlot cattle. So this project found that average daily gains could be increased by 7% when low oil distillers was included. So remember I said that there can be quite a variation in the residual oil content. So these researchers fed the low oil distillers and found that there was a 7% increase in average daily gain for backgrounding cattle. So these are grower diets when compared to high oil distillers. In this same study, they also found that there was a 2% increase in average daily gain when the high oil distillers was fed to finishing cattle. So the interesting thing that comes from this research is that it shows the benefit of feed testing. So if producers are able to test that distillers, see what the oil content is, and then they can feed it according to the animal's growth cycle. So for example, if a producer is feeding younger cattle, newly weaned calves, the low oil distillers could be fed in order to maximize the average daily gain. Whereas feeding mature cows, this research showed that potentially feeding the high oil content had a greater benefit as opposed to the low oil. So some interesting research coming out of that, and interesting for producers to be able to implement on their operations, and points to the benefits of feed testing. When it comes to carcass quality and carcass quality parameters, there's not as much research out there, or consistent research results, I guess I should say. So the projects that the BCRC was involved in kind of that 2010-2009 time period, feeding distillers up to 40% of the diet dry matter didn't impact carcass quality or marbling, but it potentially had a trend for an impact on meat color or color stability of beef in the retail case. But there's other studies that didn't show that. So there's a lot of inconsistent results when we look at the impact on actual carcass quality.
Carcass quality is really a hard one to study as is, right? Because there are so many different variables that are coming into play when it comes to what the carcass is looking like.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so it sounds like I'm really interested. I've run more of a, cow-calf, like backgrounding, but on grass. Can this be used in cow-calf operations, or is there a place for it on, the smaller ranches?
So it's a very good ingredient, protein and energy supplement to use on cow-calf operations. The one issue that these operations typically run into is availability and storage, right, unless the operation is close to an ethanol plant. So particularly if you're looking at wet distillers, for example. Wet distillers, they're 70% moisture. They've got a really limited shelf life. So cow-calf operations typically don't have the usage volume to be able to use up a truckload within 5 to 7 days before it spoils. Right. Unless they're close enough to a plant where they can get smaller volume to be able to use. Right. Whereas backgrounding or feedlot operations, depending on the size of the operation, you've got 10,000 or 20,000 head, you're using a much higher volume of the byproduct. That being said, they are an excellent energy and protein source, and they definitely do have a place that producers can figure out the best way to use them. Now, dry distillers grains are a bit more reasonable for cow-calf producers because the storage and handling is a lot less, and you can, as long as you're protecting it from wind and rain, it can store for a fairly long time, right? And it's excellent for late gestation or early lactation when those cows need that extra boost of energy and protein.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like it'd be really useful. What considerations are there when using DDGs in high forage or low energy rations?
Good question. So when it comes to low forage rations, and this has been kind of an issue the last couple of years, especially with drought in certain areas of Canada, where the forage quality just isn't really there. So the forage itself can't meet the energy and protein requirements for those cattle for growth and reproduction, lactation. So feeding protein or ensuring that you have adequate protein is essential for optimal fiber digestion, particularly when you have those low quality forages. So the rumen, I mean, we all know it's composed of bacteria, protozoa, fungi, and they work to break down that fiber. And the protein is essential in supporting the growth of those fiber digesting microbes. So that increases, as long as you've got a good population of fiber digesting microbes, it increases the fiber digestion and energy utilization. And distillers, along with soybean meal or canola meal, are really good protein sources to be able to meet that protein requirement and boost the energy digestibility or the forage digestibility for those rations. And in combination with that protein, you're getting the extra energy from the residual oil from the distillers. So you're meeting both that protein and that energy by feeding the distillers. As long as you've got a good way to feed it.
There. Well, that's kind of what I was going into. Do you think we'd ever see a time where we would have, you know, how you can go and pick up a protein tub, where we could just see DDGs in part of that mix of protein tubs where you picked up at UFA or?
I mean, it could be. I mean, depending on the feed manufacturer, they might have, components of it that are distillers already, depending, because when you are feeding distillers, you want to feed it in a way that limits losses, right? Because if you're paying, $300 a ton, you want to limit your waste, right? So, and distillers have a small particle size, so you can't spread it just on a field. It should be mixed in a TMR. If it's being fed as a single ingredient, make sure it's in a bunk. Make sure you've got sufficient bunk space so that those timid cows can come up there as well. And then even in a TMR, you want to make sure that your TMR mixer is working properly as well, so that you're not ending up with hot spots. Again, going back to the potential for sulfur or high phosphorus, right?
I'd imagine that would be one of the hardest to control factors. Like, let's say you were doing it out on pasture, not knowing exactly what their intake is would be a hard to control factor. That'd be tough. Let's talk about the pricing of it, because I think realistically anything is good if the economics work. So how do DDGs typically price out compared to other protein or energy sources?
Yeah, so typically from my experience, when looking at it as a total cost or a cost per metric ton basis, distillers typically price out lower than other protein supplements such as canola or soybean meal. However, I like to recommend to producers to make sure that they're comparing the ingredient prices on a dollars per kilo of nutrient basis. So what I mean by that is if a producer is looking to buy a protein supplement, then break that price down to the dollars per kilo of protein so that you're comparing apples to apples between ingredients. So for example, if a producer there's two protein supplements that are offered for purchase. One of them is $350 a ton and 30% protein. The other is $375, but 38% protein. When you break that price down, the higher costing supplement with the higher percent protein ends up being cheaper on a dollars per kilos of protein basis. So in the end, it will end up costing less to feed the same amount of protein per head per day. If that makes sense.
Does the uptake differ depending on protein source though? Like how much the animal can actually use?
It will depend. So when you're looking at, say, soybean meal or canola meal can have a high level of oil as well, right? So you're going to have to be limited, or there are limitations depending on the protein source that you're using, and make sure that producers need to make sure that they understand what those are and balance that ration appropriately.
Okay. And then what impact does transportation or how close the facilities are to you, what impact does that have on the economics and whether or not it's a feasible practice?
Good question. So we kind of touched on it a little bit earlier with regards to the cow-calf operations and whether it's feasible depending on how close you are to the plant. And it can have a big impact, particularly when you're looking at transportation costs, right? So for example, if wet distillers is available and a producer is farther away from the plant, that is not going to be feasible to transport, right? Because wet distillers is 70% moisture. So in every metric ton, you've got 700 kilos of water that you're transporting. And cattle get nutrients on a dry matter basis. So you got to take into account all of those factors. So looking at the physical nature of that product that you're transporting as well. There's a lot of feedlots, particularly that are in closer proximity to a plant, and they've got a really good working relationship, have consistent usage volumes, and that can really increase the level that those producers have access to from those plants. Because there will be competition from feed mills, for example, as well. They'll be purchasing ingredients, including into their rations as well. Not just for beef cattle, they'll be including it for dairy, swine, poultry, right?
Mm-hmm. For sure. And then for a consistent long-term feed option, is this something that would be, really that opportunity depends on the price and supply of what's available? Or is it something that really realistically it's typically cheap enough if you're close enough that producers could throw this into the ration all the time and count on it regularly?
So it depends. It can be a long-term feed option. Like you said, if the producer is located close to a plant, they've got kind of that consistent usage volume, a good relationship with the supplier. However, it can also be a short-term opportunity if, say, a producer suddenly has access to purchasing a truckload or two, right? And it's priced appropriately, that they can bring that onto their farm and include it into their rations. Now, one thing to keep in mind with distillers, kind of like any ingredient, is that supply can be variable. So we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic that the supplies of distillers got really, really tight, right? And a large part of this was due to fewer people driving. So there was reduced demand for ethanol. So during this time, many producers, even those that were consistent buyers of distillers, had to scramble to find alternative protein sources in order to fill to fill their feedlots and be able to balance their rations. Once drivers were back on the road, the ethanol plants revved up production again, and that supply chain was restored. So there is a lot of variability on that. And then, like I noted before, feed mills are also purchasing distillers. So there is that competition as well. And feed mills tend to have a much more consistent usage as well. So they might be given priority over producers as to who that plant is selling the byproduct to.
Right. I'm going to jump back to balancing rations. What are some of the challenges? Like, can you go a little more in depth on what some of the challenges are, especially when it comes to like, hey, I'm also adding these supplements and minerals. And I know you mentioned testing your feed, but can you talk about what producers might want to look at if, maybe there's some minerals they shouldn't be feeding or supplements they shouldn't be feeding?
So when it comes to balancing that ration, if you're including distillers in the ration and you're say you're feeding distillers along with your forages, and then you've got a mineral supplement that you're feeding to your herd as well, you want to make sure that you're balancing for that phosphorus, particularly, and maintaining that calcium to phosphorus balance. And then sulfur. So, we talked about sulfur already and the issues that you can have when you do end up having too high of a sulfur level within your ration. One of the other things with sulfur is that it's a well-known antagonist for copper. So meaning that it interferes with copper absorption. So in ruminants, copper metabolism occurs in the rumen. So that's different from a lot of other species. And within the rumen, the sulfur can interact with copper, and then it binds it and forms insoluble copper sulfate, which then just passes right through the remainder of the digestive tract. The effects of sulfur on copper can also be amplified by the presence of molybdenum. So molybdenum is a trace element that's often found in forages. And sulfur and molybdenum interact to create thiomolybdates, which bind very strongly to copper as well. And then that bound copper again becomes insoluble and can therefore not be absorbed in the intestines and can create that secondary copper deficiency. So again, test your feed so that you
Really
know
testing.
what levels you've got in there for sulfur, for phosphorus, so that you can appropriately balance those rations and meet those animal requirements. The BCRC, we have a list of feed testing labs on our website, which are all Canadian feed testing labs that producers can access if they don't know what labs that are close to them or in their area that they could send ingredients to for testing.
Are there any concerns about mycotoxins when it comes to feeding DDGs?
Yes. So as I said previously, whatever's in the parent grain is going to be 2 to 3 times more concentrated within the distillers. So mycotoxins are going to be much more concentrated. A couple of the mycotoxins to think about are DON or vomitoxin. So this would kind of be the most common one that producers would come across in testing. Zearalenone, T2 toxin, or aflatoxin. Now, aflatoxin is a big concern on the dairy side, as it can be transferred in cow's milk. Now, the CFA does have set maximum restrictions or recommended levels for or recommended maximums for toxins within beef cattle diets, and that can be found on their website. Now, one thing to note, though, is that these guidance levels are for individual mycotoxins. Now, when mycotoxins are present, they rarely occur individually. So if you have one, you've got more, right? And so it's recommended to test for a panel of mycotoxins if that is a concern. And I do recommend any producer to test for mycotoxins. You can't see them or typically smell them, but they can be there. They're often called a hidden hazard because you can't tell that they're there, but you do need to test for them. And because they can create a variety of issues for cattle, including impaired immune function, reduced productivity, so reduced growth, reduced reproduction. So they can be an issue both feedlot and cow-calf side.
And are there any signs, like early warning signs, that you can see that maybe you might be having an issue with mycotoxins?
So I would recommend producers, I don't know off the top of my head the specific signs for specific mycotoxins. So I would recommend for producers to look that information up. We do have information on beefresearch.ca on mycotoxins, which do list some of the symptoms as well as prevention measures that producers can take in order to try to prevent the development of mycotoxins, because they can develop with improper storage as well.
Awesome. And is there any research ongoing currently with BCRC when it comes to DDGs or anything recent that you want to mention?
No, the most recent research that the BCRC was involved in was around that 2009-2010. There are some projects similar to the one I mentioned in 2016, looking at the different levels of residual oil in distillers and the impact that has on intakes and efficiency. There's no new projects that I'm aware of, but I can't speak for other research associations or institutions that are out there for their research.
Right. And you guys do have a lot of information on your website. So I'm going to put that in the show notes so that there's a link to it. If you have one key piece of advice to producers that are considering DDGs in their feeding program, what would that be outside of feed tests? Because we've said that lots.
Use a ration balancing software to make sure that those ingredients are being safely incorporated within your ration. So one of these is Cowbites is available as well, and it's a very easy to use, user-friendly ration balancing program where producers can enter in the feeds that they're using, animal information, and balance that ration. So I strongly encourage producers, whether you're a feedlot backgrounding your cow-calf, make sure those rations are balanced appropriately. It's the best insurance policy against running into an issue, along with feed testing.
Well, that's fantastic. I want to thank you so much for joining me today, Kristin.
Yeah, for sure. This was fun.
And that was Kristin Thompson on Ruminating with RealAg.